So also in this class what we have is film stock, and we're going to be learning a little bit about the film stock. First we have 7222, which is the number of the stock itself. This indicates that it is, the 72 indicates that it's a 16 millimeter stock versus 52, which is a 35 millimeter stock. And the 22 identifies this to be XX negative film. So this is negative film. We also have reversal film, and this is 7266, Tri-X reversal. Okay, now on here is something that correlates to the digital technologies that they call EI. And for Tri-X reversal, note that if you're in an incandescent light or tungsten light, okay, indicated by a little incandescent light bulb, the EI is 1/60th, 160. If you're in sunlight, though, it is E200, EI200, which is faster speed. So it's a little bit faster when you're outdoors because of the spectrum of the light. Let's compare this to Eastman 7222 XX negative. In XX negative, you can see that the EI is 200 in tungsten light, and in daylight it's 250. So this is a faster film speed. The stock is a little bit faster of a speed. This is your light meter. It's a Sekonic light meter, an analog meter. And the first thing that we're going to do is to set the ISO according to what we just saw on the film stock, indicated by EI on the film stock package. Okay, so we're going to shoot indoors on Tri-X 7266. We would actually turn this, and you can see it clicks, to 160. So now the ISO on the light meter is set appropriately for shooting 7266 on the incandescent indoors or tungsten balanced EI 160 exposure index or ISO index. They correlate. So now that your light meter is set the sensor to receive light and make the appropriate calculation for the 7266, the next thing we want to do is to check that this little button here in the middle activates the needle and stops the needle, which it does. It stops it. You can see this little needle here is what we're going to be looking at. Okay. So when you take a light reading, this is the Lumisphere, and the Lumisphere is shaped cylindrically, similarly to, in a three-dimensional shape, similar to a face, so that it's going to be averaging the highlights and dark shadows, similar to the way it would read a light falling on a face. And we're going to be taking what's called an incident reading. That is that the light is falling on this meter rather than taking a reading of what's reflecting off of the subject. Okay, so we're going to take an incident light meter reading. So we're going to take an incident light meter reading. Okay, and what we're going to first do is read these foot candles, which is the top of the scale. We're going to find out how many foot candles there are. So right now the number of foot candles is falling between 160 and 320 on this top scale here. So what I'm going to do is actually zoom in a little bit. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is to press this little button, which will activate the sensor and indicate the number of foot candles, which is the very top white numbers on the top of this scale, according to this little red needle. And the needle has stopped between 160 and 320. So now that we know it's between 160 and 320, what we want to do is to set this little black triangle here between 160 and 320. Okay, so it's like a slide rule. You're going to take this figure, these calculations, and apply it here. So you're going to turn this ring between 160 and 320. And then the goal is to find out our f-stop. Okay, so let's just say we're shooting at 24 frames per second. What we want to next do is look down here to see these f-stops, okay? We're not going to be using the Cine scale for Bolex because the Cine scale is for other cameras that do not have the reflex prism apparatus that diverts some of the light to your eye and away from the film. Rather, we're going to be looking at this white scale here, right under the gold scale. And we're going to be looking for 24 frames per second, which we know to be, okay, so the first thing we're going to do is be looking at the f-stop, the first thing we're going to do is be looking at the foot candles. The first thing, all right, the first thing you'll do is to change the ISO dial to set it for 200, or 160 is between 200 and 100, so we're going to set it to 160. The first thing we're going to do is to set the ISO to 160. Now that we have set it to 160, we're going to depress this button here, and when we do that, the needle, and I'll refocus that, the red needle, okay, when I press it, the red needle will move according to the amount of light that is striking the globe, under which is the image sensor for the light meter. So the first thing I'll do is set the ISO to 160. And then the next thing that I'll do is to depress this button to watch this little needle read the light that's appropriate. It's taking a reading of the amount of light that's striking the sensor. And it's saying it's a little bit over 160. So the next thing I want to do, because the high slide isn't in, so the next thing I want to do is to position this little black triangle to a little bit higher than 160 to match the foot candle alignment. And after that, then it's like a slide rule because it's telling us down here what our f-stop will be. So at the bottom of the scale, we don't move anything further. We just have to look. Once we know that the Bolex running at 24 frames per second is 1/80th of a second, we're going to be looking between the 60 and the 125 on this ring of numbers, and look down below to find the correlating f-stop. You can recognize f-stops because it's 2.8, 4, 5.6. Those are f-stop numbers. So between 60 and 125 here is a little bit higher. It's between 2.8 and f4. So that's what you would set your f-stop on your lens accordingly. Now, if you were shooting the camera at a higher frame rate, then you would use a different number in this shutter speed scale. This is the shutter speed of the camera will be determined by how fast the camera's running. So, for example, if you're shooting 48 frames per second, it would be more like 1/60th of a second, which would be between the 125 and 250. And then you would look down here and it would be between f2 and 2.8. If there's so much light that this little needle here pins up to the top of the scale at 125K, then you'll know you need to use the high slide. And once you use the high slide, then you're going to be reading off this H triangle, which would be giving you a different number to review down here, and you would have to do a different setting. So you can see there's quite a vast difference, which would be between 10, f11, and over here, f4. So there's quite a number, 1, 2, 3, approximately 3 f-stop difference if you make a mistake on that and don't calculate for the proper triangle on this and accidentally look at the H or look at the triangle here. Your film will be either grossly overexposed or grossly underexposed as a result of that. For 1/80th of a second. Okay, so rather than looking at the traditional cine scale, which is 1/48th of a second, the Bolex shutter speed running at 24 frames per second is 1/80th of a second. So we're going to look between 60 and 1/25th, and there's going to be an imaginary line that comes right down here. So between 2.8 and 4 is where you're going to set your f-stop on your lens. Okay, so now we're going to look for the f-stop on the lens, and it tells us to go between 2.8 and f4, because we're looking at the 1/80th, which is going to fall somewhere between 60 and 125. So we look on our f-stop here, and we're going to put it between 2.8 and f4 like this. So here's 2.8 and f4, and you're basically stopping down the lens and placing it there. You can put intermediary positions. You don't have to land directly on the line. Okay, basically you can see inside the lens there's a little iris, and when we change the f-stop, we're going to turn this. Okay, basically inside the lens you can see there's a little iris like the opening of your eye. It's called the aperture in film. And when I turn the f-stop incrementally, it opens up. So I'm going to actually turn this so that you can see inside it's closing as we stop down. You can see a little tiny dot opening, which is about f16. And as I click through the increments, it's opening up. And the widest on this lens is 1.5, which is very wide open, very fast lens. So even though this is an analog light meter, it's a complicated instrument. And the thing to notice is that it has a black triangle here, and it has an H and a red pointer here. So what we want to do is to take a look at the back, and here we have what's called the high slide, which comes out. So you can take this out, and this goes in up here. And when we put that in, it blocks the light. You would use that if this little needle is pinning up to the top of the scale here. And then in that case, you would actually read the foot candles. In this case, it says 30. So we're going to place the H between 20 and 40. So it's important to understand that you have to use the H red arrow when the high slide is in, and when the high slide is not in, you use the black arrow. The other variable on the light meter is the frame rate that you set. So when you set the Bolex to run at a different speed, your frame rate changes, and we're going to learn about that. If you click pixelation, for example, it will be 1/40th of a second, which is somewhere between 30 and 60. So in this case, it would be f8. But if you were to shoot at 48 frames per second, for example, it would be 1/60th of a second. So that would be between 125 and 250, and then the f-stop would be at f4. Okay, next we're going to take a look at the Canon T3i camera that we're also going to be using in this class. And what we want to do is understand the correlation between digital technologies and the film technique. And that's why we're learning the film technique in part, so that you have a thorough understanding of cinematography. To use this camera, you're basically going to start by putting it into movie mode. And notice it has an ISO button. That correlates directly to the EI of the film stock. In this case, it's the image sensor sensitivity Let me find out exactly what that is. Okay, the ISO, according to some internet sources, actually stands for International Standard of Organization. Let's see. ISO actually stands for International Organization of Standardization. But I think it'd be easier if we just think of it as the image sensor organization or image sensor reading. What it really means is how sensitive should you set up your sensor for the amount of light that's coming in? Because if you can set it up to 6400, ISO 6400, then you could film in a very dark situation. If you had it set at ISO 100, it would be a very bright situation. So you're basically telling the sensor to be determining its other functions. Well, you're telling the sensor, you're determining the sensitivity of the sensor according to the amount of light that's coming in through the lens. Okay, so what is ISO? ISO is an adjustment that you can make. It's actually a setting on the camera that you would set for 6400, 100 to 6400 on the digital. And anyway, we're going to switch over to the video for that.